Hi, welcome to the next part in our WinUAE installation guide. In this section I will be introducing you to the mechanics of WinUAE, and as you can see the latest version 2.70 is on the screen, and if we click the contributors we can actually find a long list of the contributors of this title, and some of those are well known, some of those are not, and we can also find direct links to the WinUAE homepage and the UAE homepage, and SPS, the Software Preservation Society, and AmiKit we can buy your kit from. So that's the About menu. If we click on Paths in here we will find the links to all the files that we need to link to and from, and if you remember we linked to and from the ROMs files, usually set to Amiga ROMs, and the main configuration file is set to configurations here, and that's Win7 configurations. Our screenshots will go into the screenshots directory, and screenshots is yet again another directory off the main Amiga archive. Our save states can be saved in here, and the videos, which we shall see later on, we can rip videos, and we can also save videos, save images, not to be confused with saving screenshots, which is a different thing altogether. And rips, these are basically audio rips, which is in the output there. We can actually output audio, as we shall see a little later on, but that's the paths. If we make sure the cache configuration files is highlighted there, that will save our paths on exit. If we take a look down there, we can see the main UAE directory is listed in the default ROM paths, and below there we can see a debugging tool. That's the WinUAE bootlog, which we can record all our failures to, and we can send that off to the author and report bugs. But the paths are all set up now. The next option is Quickstart, and if we select this from the load we can actually select a number of Quickstart options, and we can select the Amiga of our choice from 500 to 3000. We can set up the configuration of that Amiga, and we can also give that high compatibility, and by inserting a disk there we can insert a floppy image, and then we can simply start from there. That is the quick start option. Or if power users are involved, then they like to get under the bonnet and to check out all the other power options, and so hence this review. So clicking on the configurations will save all our power options there onto the hard drive, and you can see a number of configurations there already. I've pre-configured an Amiga 500 there with different kickstarts and different ROMs. I've even equipped that with an old 20 there, and the Amiga 1200 there is in its entirety with the old 20. The Amiga 3000 has an O30 and an O40 CPU in there with Kickstart 3, and by the time we get to the Amiga 4000 AGA then the O40 or the O60 is in there with Kickstart 3.1 or even 3.9 there. So you can set up your configurations to your heart's content. To load a configuration you click on that and click load, and if we make any changes we can then return to this panel, click that option again and click save, and that will save that up. There is also save as command, and we can also add extra information such as this ADFs, which will give us extra information that we can add about those things, which will make it easier to find those and navigate around that menu. If we go ahead and load the basic Amiga 500, you'll find in the hardware the CPU is the 000, and more compatible mode is recommended for A500 setups. You'll find the approximate A500 cycle exact is listed there, and that means it moves at A500 speed. You can make that fastest possible to try and get more speed out of that 000, but the approximate speed there, make sure that it runs exactly the right speed, and you can even change the CPU speed there if you select fastest. And cycle exact mode there, it's actually on 0 at the moment because we've selected A500, but that can be changed a little later on. And JIT settings, well, just in time is operating on the 040, on the 060 CPU, and we can have JIT settings that will speed the machine up. If we go ahead and load the 030 from the options there and take a look, well, that allows us to run that 030 at basically any speed. We can have that A500, Amiga 1200 or 4000 speed, and so with the 28 megahertz there. And we can also change the JIT on that as well and make sure that that runs as fast as possible. With the JIT on 8 megabytes, that gives it all the hardware it requires to run that 030, 040 and even 060 at full speed. So that's the JIT options. If you want that more compatible with your games, it's best if you turn off the JIT. But if you have power intensive applications like Vista, the landscape generator, then turn the JIT on and you'll find that much quicker. And so DPaint also benefits from the JIT. We can also add an FPU, a floating point unit, which is a coprocessor. We can add that onto the 030, and the fastest is the 82 there. You can make that more compatible. And again, if you have Vista or a Lightwave package, something that requires CPU power, then certainly the JIT and the FPU is necessary. Otherwise, for most games, that won't make too much of a difference. In fact, most games don't like coprocessors and JIT, so it's best to turn that off. And so with the 030 there, you can actually set that fast as possible and again max out those frequency settings. On the chipset, this is where we find the cycle exact, and that makes the emulation conform to the exact cycle rate of the Amiga. We go back and check that out, and we can set that once again, and we can no longer change the exact size and speed, but we can change the configuration, and that will lock the Amiga 3000 at 14 megahertz or even 7 megahertz there, and that might make the 030 more compatible with games. And certainly cycle exact on is a nice option to select if you have problems running games. But again, let's return to the basic floppy drive of the Amiga 500. That does not need cycle exact if we've already got that on the approximate A500 speed anyway, but if we want to make sure, we can select cycle exact, set that to Amiga 500 speed, 7 megahertz there. In the chipset, we'll find the chipset of the machine, OCS there for the Amiga 500, which goes up to AGA for Amiga 1200s and 4000s. You can add Agnes's and Super Denise into that, and the full ECS will give us the full chip RAM, the full 1 meg chip RAM, and that's also handy to remember looking at the RAM settings, because if you do not have the Agnes processor, then you will not be able to have the full chip RAM. In this case, the Amiga 500 can only allow 512 chip RAM there, and we can have up to 8 megabyte fast RAM there, but just 1 meg I've selected for this experiment, and that's good for most Amiga 500 games. Any more than that and it's basically overkill. So OCS for the Amiga 500, and we don't really need to turn off sprite collision detection, and in my experience that doesn't do a great deal. To turn off the sprite collision detection in the games, that basically switches off the sprite fields, so always leave that at full if you want to play games, and that's for debugging only, really for professionals, so leave that on full. If you also find that the game stutters, then wait for blitter can sometimes help. That waits for the screen to catch up, and that sometimes flicker fixes some jitters in games. We can also select immediate blitter. If we switch off the cycle exact, immediate blitter is also another debug option, which will save the screen flickering and loading problems and things like that. So cycle exact usually is the best option for the Amiga 500, and the extra chipset is selected on Amiga 500 as well. If we select the Amiga 3000 again and we look at that chipset, that is actually selected as Amiga 1200 to make that more compatible, but that should really be set to Amiga 3000 there to give us the full Amiga 3000 experience. A3000 on full ECS mode there. The Amiga 3000 does not have AGA, unfortunately. And again, cycle exact is on 28 MHz. So let's save that. So that chipset A3000 is saved. On the advanced chipset menu, that gives the technical hardware a full run for its money. If we click off the compatibility mode, we can add and simulate these extra compatibility settings. We can switch on and off the PC MCIA, for example, and switch off different ROMs, but really those for hardware freaks and fanatics. We can also tweak the Ramsey revision of the Gary and the Agnes there, so that we can fool the Amiga into thinking that that has a different revision than what it has, and fool the Lisa and Denise there. But again, compatible settings are the best option for playing games, and really most people, myself included, don't really need to bother with the advanced chipset. Leave that on compatible. In the ROM, we find on the Amiga 3000 that has the Quickstart 3 ROM there, and if we take a look at the Amiga 500 again and load that up, that will have the Amiga Kickstart 1.3 in there, revision 34.5, and that's for the Amiga 500. The extended ROM, maybe if you want to emulate CD TVs or the CD32, then you can have an extended ROM chip in there, and you must remember to set that if you're setting up those specific emulations. And we can actually map ROM emulation there, which means that will buffer into our memory, and map ROM will make sure the Kickstart boots instantly and blazes quickly there. And shapeshifter support means we can have macROM support, and that means shapeshifter will work. And we can also patch the ROM image so that the shapeshifter will work. If we forget to do that, then we cannot run shapeshifter emulation on our Amiga. But we will not be running shapeshifter in this experiment, and certainly with an Amiga 500 setup there, running shapeshifter would be impossible. We can also insert cartridges in there, freeze frame or a HD monitor, built-in monitor there if we want to monitor the activity in the RAM, and we can actually have flash RAM files there, so we can actually save and load flash RAM in there, and real-time clock files. Well, we don't really need to bother with that. I'm not quite sure what that means, but we can have real-time clock support, which should be built in anyway. So the ROM basically is the only thing that we need to concern ourselves, and that is Amiga 500 in this case, and that means the RAM, as we say, will be a half meg and a 1 meg fast RAM. But if we have the fatter Agnes, or the fastest Agnes there, and reload that, that means the RAM will be 2 meg there, because we can have 2 meg with the Agnes, and 8 meg there fast memory. The slow memory there is therefore on chip fast RAM, which is not needed in this setup. If we have an Amiga 3000, we can add Z3 fast RAM up to 1.2 gigabytes worth. You'll find that works for applications but not for games. And 32-bit RAM is pretty similar. We can have 1 gig of 32-bit RAM from an accelerator card, that kind of thing. But a normal slotting card in a trapdoor works with this fast RAM. This is slow fast RAM from a trapdoor slot, but that is most compatible with games. So I'd select maybe 2 meg if you want the most compatible ever, and again half meg if you want that really compatible. But on the Amiga 3000 we can have 2 meg in there, and if we actually start that emulation, that should boot with our Amiga 3000, and we should see there 2 meg, and it's already used most of a meg there, already booting Workbench, but that gives us a full 2 meg chip RAM, which is handy for certain applications. And again, if we increase that to 8 and reset that, then that should give us more fast RAM to play with, and that's ideal for every application under the sun, unless you want power RAM, and then you're not out to have that. So total configured RAM there. And we can also add extra Amiga 3000 and 4000 specific RAM there if we set up that. And even though this is an Amiga 3000, we won't be doing that, but yes, you can add that as well. That again makes it incompatible with some games. Returning to our Amiga 500 configuration, we can select the most important aspect of the Amiga 500 configuration, and that is inserting a floppy. and from this panel we can choose the number of drives available. In this case we have 2 drives available. We can also insert DH2 and DH3, so we can have up to 4 drives available there, and we can have more than that, as we shall see later on. When we insert a disk by clicking on these 3 lines, we'll just insert an Amiga blank disk in there. That means it is automatically unwrite protected, and on this version we can even click on the question mark and that will give us a printout of the boot block. It is a blank disk, and so it has no boot block whatsoever. But if we should eject that disk and insert All Terrain Racing and inspect that boot block, we'll find a custom boot block. It is a valid boot block, and we can see there that that will boot. If we eject that and insert the second disk and inspect that, that is a custom boot block, NDOS there, and that will not boot. So that just gives us extra info about that ADF. We can also insert HD ADFs using this method. By clicking on that, we can extend the ADF size to a large ADF. I think you can have 1.7 megabyte ADFs using a HD ADF, but 880k using the standards. We can also emulate SCOM 3.5-inch drives there, which is practically a useless thing, but SCOM drives, those buggy SCOM drives, can be emulated in that fashion. But leaving that as 3.5-inch, if we eject that from the floppy drive and select a normal bootable disk, in fact let's check out an AP disk, an Amiga Power disk, and if we now select start, that should boot that disk, and it should load whatever that disk contains. In this case we've decided to load Amiga Power cover disk number 3, which contains an Exile demo and a demo of Prehistoric, a Tiles game, and Fantastic Freddy, which is a PD game, as well as Amoeba Invaders, which we've covered already. So if we press, sometimes if we press the F12 key to bring up our menu, that doesn't seem to work if we resize and move the page around, and sometimes we have to close that and start up the package all over again. And that's all you have to do to load floppy games using the Amiga 500 setup. And we can also add CD-ROM drives and hard drives and expansion cards, as we shall see. So in here on the Amiga 500, adding a hard drive certainly is possible, but I'd certainly recommend something like an Amiga 3000 configuration, and if we load this up we will find 2 already in here. And as we've seen, we can add hard files, and I've already done a number of videos on how to add hard files. All you have to do is add the size, click create, path that in there, add the file system and the directory, enable RGB mode if you want that to be recognized within Workbench, and that's how you basically add a hard file. Just remove that, and we already have a hard file listed in here. If we take a look at this hard file, we've named this Amiga HD6, and that runs on Pro File System 3. So if you can see there, the handler Pro File System DS, compatible with Quickstart 1.3, and that means that Pro File System 3 will load in every version of Workbench and every version of Quickstart. It's fully compatible, and because that is PFS3, that will load pretty speedily. That is our DHO. You can see the size there is almost 2 gigabytes in size, and basically our DHO is full already. But that's how I've set up yet another PFS3 drive on our WinUAE, and if we look in here, we've actually set up Workbench as a directory. That's right, even if we have Workbench installed on our PC, we can select add a directory, and what that will do is, well, we can insert a device name DH1 there, and we can set even a volume label, but selecting a directory as a path there in our Amiga Workbench directory on our PC, you can see a Workbench directory there, and what that actually contains is all the Workbench files on our PC. And if we scroll down, we can actually see installations of Workbench there on our PC. We can have Workbench 3 there, which contains the Workbench 3 files, and we can also have Workbench 3.9 there fully installed. but in the main directory this is the default Workbench 3.1 install, and so if I select that folder, then this C will be our Workbench C, and S will be that Workbench S in that folder. So if we select Workbench, and we can also even eject a disk at any point, but that is basically what this is all about. Our DH1 is called Workbench. It's pathed into our emulator's Amiga Workbench drive, which is our Workbench disk on our PC. That means Workbench will never crash, our Workbench disk will never corrupt, and we can access all our Workbench files from our PC. And yes, there is nothing to stop you setting up a directory, a blank directory on your Amiga, setting that up as a new HD file and setting that up as another directory. And yes, you can copy files into that as long as you like, and that will have an unlimited file size. But in this case we have set up Workbench as bootable, and that will basically boot. If I click start there, that will now boot into our Workbench from our PC. You can see all our PC drives are still there, and this is our Workbench. This is our PC files in the Workbench, and 3.9 there is set up as a separate drive. That is exactly how we have it on our PC. Even 1.3 there, Workbench 1.3, the icon is present, and the files themselves, this is our PFS3 hard drive, which we shall see later on is installed with all our utilities, and that's practically full. So returning, there you go, that's the PFS3 and the hard drive as linked from our PC. We can also add an Amiga hard drive if we have an authentic Amiga hard drive there, by clicking on that and selecting the drive letter. You can see all our PC hard drives are listed, and if one of those was an Amiga hard drive with an Amiga file system, we could port that across, and I certainly have done that with a 2.5 inch to 3.5 inch converter. I have ported across a 2.5 inch A1200 drive onto my PC using that, and it will work using that method. We can also add SCSI tape drives, and we can even assign CD drives using our PC CDs and assign those in to our Amiga, and include removable drives there to add those, and auto mount those on our Amiga side as well. If we don't want our PC drives on the Amiga side, then we simply do not need to include those, and a simple reset. Well, sometimes you have to reboot the PC in order for that to work, and in order for that configuration to work, but if we do that, then those drives will not appear. Everything else you don't really need to worry about. You can use the recycle bin and link that to your PC. You can auto mount those CDs there, but that should do that anyway. You can limit the file size of drives to 1 gig to make that more compatible, but there's really no need to do that. But the other interesting option on this page is actually the CD option, and this will allow us to insert a CD into our Amiga. And you can see a number of CDs I've pre-installed already, and we have Bubble Heroes for example as a Q file, and we can also select on the CD image there, we can select Q files, and we can select CCDs and ISOs there if we have an ISO image. So again, if we return to Bubble Heroes and select OK, then given some time that should appear on our Amiga, and we can then install Bubble Heroes just like that. Or again, if we should eject that disk, let's just select another one, Nemac 4 there, and if we click OK, Nemac 4 appears, and we can install that from the CD. So we don't need a PC CD-ROM to run CDs, we can simply insert those into WinUAE, and so by ejecting that, that will automatically disappear. We can actually use that on the fly, just like the floppy mechanism. We can insert floppy disks on the fly, and we can also insert CDs as well. Unfortunately, we cannot insert hard drives on the fly, they are built in, and your WinUAE will crash if you try to do that. Moving on to the expansions. If you want retargetable graphics support, then you click on RTG. In here, all you have to do is select a card of your desired choice. Picasso there, Piccolo card, Picasso Mark IV there is probably the best one out of them all. We can select the memory size of that, and we can select the various Picasso options, including double or triple buffering there, and automatic scaling down to whatever you require. Some games do require retargetable graphics, and the only way to do that is to set that up and to load that before you start your Amiga, and then that will run. If we take a look at the RTG, which I've already pre-configured, and we'll look at the expansions I've already set up. That's our old card there, 32 megabytes, and that's already set up there to run my RTG games. Unfortunately, you do need to set up RTG on the Amiga side, and we won't be seeing how to set up RTG on the Amiga side in this review, but the expansion cards are there. You can certainly set that up on the hardware side. If you have a Catweasel card on your PC, then selecting Catweasel compatibility will help you connect those, and the WinUAE SCSI device there is essential. That will basically give us access to those SCSI devices on our hard drives. And if we have a dial-up connection, we can enable the BSD socket library, and if we want Ethernet support, then we can either have a SANA 2 compatible Ethernet network device, or if we want to emulate an Ethernet card, we can select Ethernet compatibility with that, and we can also manually line that up and emulate that. But we won't have any networks for this experiment, and we don't have any fancy expansion cards either. So let's return to our Amiga 3000 setup, and don't bother having any graphics cards in there. But that's how you set up the Amiga 3000. And again, once you've set up your hardware to your heart's content, you return to configurations and save those up. We can also click on the hardware tab and save those hardware elements separately, and we can have those auto load as well by clicking on this tab, and that will auto load our machine to whichever one we desire. We can save those in exactly the same way, and that separates them from all the other options, our display, sound, game ports and other options, which we can have as a separate hosts file, which again auto loads. We can have that auto load on load, and we can have our Quickstart auto load on load as well. So there are a number of auto load options in this program. In this second section we'll find all our expandables and tunables, and in the first one we'll find display. We can usually leave the display set up as our generic, or I can set up my existing graphics card in there, the 880 GT, which was the fastest at one time but now it is slow. We can also change the size of the full screen window when we select full screen mode. We can launch the application in full screen mode or in Windows mode, and in Windows mode it will look at this option. We can see from here we can change the size of the window, and in windowed mode it also helps turn on low latency applications as well. That will actually help us sync on this particular monitor, and it will help avoid flicker. So in windowed mode that will load, and if we select start, that will load in windowed mode just like this. And again we can change the size of that window given these options. So if we turn on and off the centering there, that will shift that in a relative position, and we can also change the resolution relative to the monitor. If we have a very low res monitor, we can select low res, and that will basically scrunch that up, and we can also have that as super high res there, which will put that into a super low dimension. But usually the high res mode, the normal mode, is the one to select, and you can even change the line mode. We can have single scan line mode there, or have scan lines on the display there to emulate one of those old fashioned CRT monitors or an old fashioned TV. But for this, double line mode is the best because that's clear and we can see what's going on. And you might notice the screen is actually centered there. We'll get onto that later on, but the null filter is on there. If we didn't have the null filter, then the screen will be slightly to one side, and we can see a huge black border there and borders everywhere. So by selecting that null filter, it just makes sure that everything is basically in the middle. Returning to display options once again. So the top rate there, the triple buffering is best on most monitors. That will mean that the display is buffered well, and the default refresh rate there, we can have that refresh up to 85 Hz, but the default 50-60 Hz there for the Amiga is the default that we shall have. So yes, we can center that up. We looked at the line mode, and there is an interlace line mode as well. We can even change the refresh rate there from PAL to NTSC, and that will change from 50 to 60 frames per second display, and by scrolling that we can adjust that manually as well up to 99, and so that will move very much more quickly on 99, and so you will see these things appearing much more quickly. And if we turn that down, then everything slows down to a grind. So if you want the original Amiga experience, then PAL is definitely recommended, and so we should be able to select that, and there we go, PAL 50 Hz. We can even change the brightness there, the native brightness, and the contrast and the gamma can also be changed if we want to change those. And well, sometimes it's best just to leave those alone and adjust the actual things on your monitor, and we can even reset those to defaults with a press of a button. But leaving those on defaults for now, that's the display screen. We can also tweak our sound, and in here we can change the primary sound device, and basically the sound output driver from our PC is the one that we should find. And sound emulation fully enabled, and automatic switching there means that that is on and off when the window is selected, and sometimes when you click away from the window then that sound won't switch off unless you have that automatically switching. You can even turn off the Amiga sound there, but there really is no point doing that. The master audio can be found here, and in here we can change the polar settings, and I find half of the Windows sound is the best compromise. Can even change the CD audio volume there and change that up and down on the fly. The sound buffer size is best left at number 8, although if your sound is stuttering it might be best to raise that, and if your sound's playing too fast you can always lower that, but usually buffer 8 is the best to have. You can even change the separation, the stereo separation there, which is probably best left on 90 unless you have speakers close together. And if you leave this on basically high frequency and A500 emulation there, that will basically emulate the Amiga's 500 sound as best as possible. We can even change the filter there, and we can have the A1200 filter on there, and that will emulate the filters on the Amiga. And lastly, floppy drive sound emulation we can turn on and off. If we select A500, that will select floppy drive emulation, and we can change the volume of that with that slider there, and we can even change the volume of different drives there. We can have no effect or a volume on DF1, we can select high or low volume for that. So fully tweakable options there. And as far as the drivers go, it is probably best to leave all these on, and direct sound or all these hardware plugins that you need to run that on a PC. So leave all those on. If we look at our A500 configuration there and check out the sound display, you will find the A500 built-in is already switched on there, and that's 38% volume. So if we go ahead and load an ADF using the floppy drives, we can load the ADF in there, arcade pool, and when that boots you can hear the drive running. Returning to the options, the next option is our game ports, and from here we can select the mouse or the joystick or the tablet maybe, or whatever is installed in our DB9 game ports. And so in game port 1 we have the mouse, and we can select the Windows mouse or Windows variant compliant, and those will do just about the same thing, i.e. we can use our Windows mouse on our Amiga. We can select to have auto fire on the mouse, but we shall not select that for this experiment. And in port 2 there you can see the USB Amiga joystick is in there, the retro joystick adapter 2.1, and we also have had in the past 4-point adapters using a parallel port, and if you have a 4-port adapter there, select that in port 2, and if you have a 4-port adapter you can actually emulate that, so you can actually have one player playing on keyboard, one player playing on joystick, another player using a separate keyboard, and another player using a third controller option there, so that you can actually have 4 players playing and emulated all at once. But usually the best thing to do is to turn off the options there and select your joystick in port 2 and your mouse in port 1. We can even remap those things. We can have left and right and up and down remapped. If you want to change that during a flight simulator, we can do that using the hardware method, using that. And so we can remap all these ports as well. We can have instant auto fire always on there on our joystick if we don't have auto fire built into that, or we can toggle that on and off. But I select no auto fire because my joystick already has auto fire. We can even swap ports on the fly there, so if your joystick requires port 1 in there, we can swap ports, but that is not like a Commodore 64 that definitely requires joystick port swaps, so that joystick port is almost useless, but it's there anyway. So that's the joysticks covered, and the extensions. If you want to play Dyna Blaster, we can have an NX Arcade layout as well if you want to use a PC joystick. We can insert even an Xbox joystick, a joypad into this, and it will work absolutely no problem. If you find your mouse speed is slow, then change the mouse speed option here. It's probably best to leave that on 100%, and then your mouse speed will work as fast as possible. And we can turn on Magic Mouse, and we can install a virtual mouse driver as well if you find your PC mouse is not compatible with your Amiga, or if you want to use an Amiga mouse and trying to get that compatible with your PC. So installing virtual mouse drivers can sometimes work, and mouse speed there is best to leave on 100 unless you find the mouse speed is too fast for a game such as Arkanoid, and then you might want to reduce the mouse speed if your modern mouse is too fast for an old Amiga game. Moving on, in the I/O ports we can change the printer options if we have a printer in there, and yes, we can change our native PC printer and select that and print off Amiga files through our Amiga. We can also change the pass-through so that emulates a dot matrix printer as well, and so we can have 2 printers connected to our Amiga. We can select Ghost Script extra modes if we have a laser printer, and in here we can also change the serial options. So if we want to emulate a mouse or a COM port, this really is to emulate a bulletin board system and a direct dial-up system. But if you have direct dial-up or a board machine that runs on 300 baud modems, then here is how you select the serial port. And we can have that as COM1 as our PC serial port, or we can emulate that using a network connection. In here we can also choose our MIDI sequencer options, and so we can have MIDI support, which was not native to our native Amiga, so we won't have that, but we can output that as well. And if the Amiga requires any protection dongles, in case we insert Robocop 3 or World Class Leaderboard or Leviathan perhaps, then the dongles can be emulated through that dongle protection. But I have never actually seen that in effect, so that's just an extra emulation there. So let's not have any serial ports in this, and let's not waste time having any printers either. But that's how you set up printers and serial ports and protection. In the input panel we can actually swap and toggle our aspects of our joystick and our mouse and remap those. We can change our digital joystick speed there if we have digital joysticks or mice connected, and if we have an analog joystick, like if we are playing F1 GP, then we can actually tune the analog joystick speed using that option, and even the auto firing rate there and the dead zones for analog joysticks and mice. So that's handy if we require an Xbox 360 steering wheel, which we shall see and which we saw in a later section. We can use the steering wheel dead zone options there and tweak those on the Amiga side and also on our PC side. So that's definitely handy to remember for wheels and joypads which require analog. Moving on, the output section allows us to record whatever process that we have on screen. We can record the audio in whatever format we like, and we can also record the video, and it will give us a number of sampled options. The Microsoft one is a pretty terrible video compressor, and the full frames uncompressed is therefore a very fast machine. The TechSmith will not work because that is part of my Camtasia package, but if you have Xvid or DivX there, that's not a bad one to choose. But uncompressed frame rate will ensure that we have absolute full immaculate quality video and with sound there, and we can actually disable the frame rate limit so that captures as many of those frames as possible, and because the Amiga runs at 50 frames per second, every frame counts. Capture before filtering is an option for the filters option, which we still haven't got to, and that will mean that the filters are not applied before capture. And disable sound sync, well, it's best to have that on because that enables sound sync, sound and video. We can have AVI output enabled there, and when we click that, whenever we play a game and click start, that will automatically record and that will output into the paths which we set up earlier on. If we click paths there, then our rips will record to the rips directory. So output there also allows us to take screenshots and rip sound samples and music. So if we should go ahead and we are just going to load, so if we go ahead and load Apidia there, then if we return to the output menu, we can save a screenshot of our current screenshot. That will save automatically a screenshot to our screenshots directory there. We can also select take screenshot before filtering, and that takes the screenshots before the filter options are enabled. If we select the Pro Wizard option, that will actually enable us to rip mods and packed sound files from games, but in this case we'll select no, and actually it's found 3 mods there, and there is also a sample ripper. If you run that, if you have something running in the background, that will rip the samples and save those using the paths again. So the playback of recording can be accessed by this button, and yes, you can play back your own recordings, you can re-record and sample all your own recordings, you can have an automatic replay which will replay those, and you can even change the recording buffers as well in this option, and it's best to have those off. Moving on to the filters, as we have seen, the filters changes the size of the screen. We can have no filters. The null filter will center that up. And we can also scale that x2. Scale that twice the size, of course, for obvious reasons. And we can even have PAL there, which is probably the best default. And you can see that messes up the colours as well. So best to leave that on a null filter, and you can even scale that to your heart's content. If you have a widescreen TV, automatic center is probably the best option if you're going to scale that. You can even scale horizontal and vertically there in increments, and we can even change the horizontal and vertical position there. You can see that moving up and down on the screen. So you have a wide variety of in-game tweaks there on the fly. You can even change the aspect ratio there. If you have a widescreen TV, you can customize that, and you can force it to keep the aspect ratio, which is a really good idea on Amiga games, and force that to sync to a TV. So we can play that, it should play that game at full size and full sync to a TV. At the bottom here we can even have presets, so we can have auto scaling preset there, or PAL preset. We can load and save our filter settings as well, but I'd recommend the null filter is good for most games, and don't bother scaling that, or at least scale that to your TV, and then that will play and you can see that full size. And certainly full window is the best display, although I can't display that and I can't screen wrap that at the same time. But full display will usually display your Amiga games, as I say, at full size and at full rate. So always select full screen if you want to do that. Moving on, the disk swapper will allow us to swap disks in our floppy drives. You may remember before I said that we can only insert 4 floppy disks there because we can only have 4 floppy drives chained in a row. But if we select the disk swapper, we can select any images that we like from our ADFs, and if we insert a few ADFs in there, and just to fill that up, when we are happy with our drive selection, if we click on one of these disks and select drive, then that will appear in DFO, and we can also insert this blank disk into DF1, and so we can also change those around, DFO, DF1, and so if we want to play ATR, then we can select ATR in DFO, and we can select the second disk in DF1. So that just saves us swapping disks around, and when we check the floppy drives, yes, ATR disk 1 is in disk 1, disk 2 is in drive 2. So the disk swapper there, if we want to play Forget It instead, then put Forget It in DFO there, return to our floppy drives, and we'll find Forget It is in. So if we click Start, then that should boot. You must replace volume test sheet in unit 0. Then that will load our game, and in this case it's Forget It, which is a very terrible game indeed, but let's just see if that loads. Well, that's Forget It, and so let's just forget that one, and that's how you use the disk swapper to swap your disks around. So let's eject those, and we can remove those at any point, and yes, we can load and save those as well at our heart's desire. And in the miscellaneous menu you will find all the bells and whistles that tech heads like to press, and nothing really in here for our interest, mainly the graphics API. It should be set to direct draw if you find any problems with that. If you have a modern graphics card and it's fully compatible with Direct 3D, then select Direct 3D and your WinUAE should take care of that. If you have direct draw, then you can sometimes select the direct draw RAM if you have a graphics card with extra RAM, and you can even change the style of the WinUAE pop-up window from standard, borderless to extended. The standard is good enough for us, and the SCSI CD DVD access there isn't selected because we haven't got a SCSI drive on our PC. The GUI language there is set to auto detect, but English is built in there, and you can even change the font and the size of the graphics user interface if you can't read that, and you can even select a resizable GUI there, so that you can drag the window and make that small and make that big. So you can even resize the GUI there, which is fantastic. And taking a look at the other options, the untap middle button option is incredible because this allows us to freeze and pause the emulation during play. So basically, if I continue the emulation and press the middle button on the mouse, which is the one which has the wheel on there, that will basically allow the pointer to free up, and you'll notice that the display keeps on playing there even when the window isn't selected, and that's because the priorities are set to not pause the emulation. If you want the emulation to pause, when you click off the emulation, then you select this. When it's inactive, pause the emulation and disable the sound. That will mean when we use the start the game again, untap the mouse, and when we click off the WinUAE, it will then pause, and we can bring up any amount of web browsers and everything else on the top. When we return to WinUAE, we'll then continue. And so the untap middle mouse button there certainly is a great option, and I'd recommend leaving that on. I certainly recommend leaving Show GUI on startup on as well, unless you want to boot immediately into your Amiga or boot immediately into a game. So Show GUI, and this is the GUI, basically the graphics user interface, leave that switch on. We can also use Control and F11 to quit WinUAE if we select that with the box, and we can also don't show taskbar button if we don't not want that to appear, and don't show taskbar icon notifications if we don't want those to appear. Always on top means that WinUAE will rise above every other window on your desktop, It helps to disable the screensaver because you don't want the PC screensaver appearing halfway through a game. We can synchronize WinUAE with our PC clock. We can toggle faster RTG if we want to hack the RTG mode and have faster retargetable graphics. We can share the clipboard with our PC and our Amiga, which can get confusing sometimes if we have data in both. We can allow native code, which I'm not sure quite what that does, but if we allow a native on-screen display there, that will... You can see that brings up the on-screen display from the bottom. We can have power and HD and floppy drives shown there in a window in windowed mode, and even on full screen mode we can have those display within our Amiga screen area. But if we should press that button again, switch that off, that will get rid of our instrument panel from the bottom of the screen. We can also have those appear on RTG mode as well if we want to have RTG specific displays. Create logs is a good idea if your machine crashes and you want to send those off to the author. Log illegal memory addresses and create log file are there for debug purposes, and blank unused displays is there basically if you want one display to show your Amiga and that's it. And start with mouse uncaptured, well that's best unless you want to capture your PC mouse while you're playing the Amiga. If you want the application to start minimized and then you can pull that up at your leisure, then that's the option for you. And minimize when focus is lost, basically when you click away from your WinUAE screen that will automatically minimize to your taskbar, and as we've seen that will also pause and disable the sound as well. If we have an old monitor, then we might want to emulate a VSync blank there, 100 to 120 Hz. If we have an old monitor, or if we want to emulate that, we can click that on. And master floppy write protection, if we click that on and return to our floppy drives, that will actually master protect all those floppy drives so that we cannot read or write to them. And the master floppy drive protection there is probably best off, and that may have made more sense in the floppy drives section, but that's where it is. And hide WinUAE auto boards, you might as well leave that switched off because there's no point doing that. Below is a save state option, and this is where we can load and save Amiga save states. By clicking on load, that will bring up a directory of all the save states that we've saved so far, and in this case we have a number of those. Captain Planet there, Toyota Celica GT Rally. When I click on those, that will automatically load the save state from the exact position where we left off. And in order to save a state, all we need to do is to press F12, return to the Miscellaneous tab and select Save State, and that will save our current state to a save file. And so if I rename that Celica GT2, then that's basically what it is. I can now load that up, Celica GT2, and that will load the state that we've just saved. We can have a number of saves there in our save states, and games like Escape from Colditz there really do appreciate a long save state because these kind of games really do take time to master. But you can see there, clicking on and off the display screen will actually freeze the time on that thing. That's how you load and save states. We can load those automatically with this toggle as well. Below that is the keyboard LED function. If your PC keyboard has LEDs on the front there, you can either have those showing the regular numlock, caps lock and scroll lock functions, or you can actually change those so that they actually show the Amiga's powered DFO and DHO there. That means they will flash in accordance with your Amiga, and you can see the DFO and the DHO flashing away there on your PC keyboard. If that is too much of a distraction, then you can return the keyboard to its usual power functions, and you can even have the CD there if you want the CD appearing on your PC keyboard. The USB mode enables the entire package to locate its files locally instead of on the extended paths, and really USB mode is best to select at the start, and then it will find all those paths locally, and instead of you having to find those, it will find those in its nearest directory in an emergency. Finally, the final options panel is our priorities and extensions, and as we have seen, we can set the priority to run at low, medium or high. in any state from active, inactive or not active at all. So when it isn't active at all, this emulation pauses and disables, and when it isn't active it does the same thing, and when it's active I will actually select that to run above normal, and then that emulation has full priority. Below that, file extension associations means we can actually trigger these USS, which is user save state. We can load those from outside of our WinUAE directory, and if we should load those we can double click on their icon and that will go through WinUAE and boot those. We can also automatically boot ADFs there and WinUAE configuration files there, and even IPFs, which is a special ADF variants file, and DMSs and ADZs as well, which is a compressed file. We can have those extensions recognized through RPC. So associate all is probably the best option to select. And finally, right at the bottom you can see an error log, and clicking on this will locate all the errors that we've managed to find during this playthrough of WinUAE, and there are a few errors piled up there. If you want to clear that log, then select clear, and that will get rid of that from that part of the menu. And the other options, of course, if you want to restart WinUAE, you select that, and that will mean we shall have to select a new configuration before that restarts, otherwise it will restart and give us no configuration whatsoever. We can reset the machine if we've started the Amiga, and we can finally quit UAE. Thanks a lot for your patience of this WinUAE technical guide, and I hope to see you again in our next part when we shall see another technical analysis of these configurations and how to operate them on the Amiga side. So I hope that's given you a quick overview of WinUAE and all its functions, and I'll see you then. Cheers.